The plane's wheels should have touched the runway, but instead, disaster struck just seconds before. With the landing gear malfunctioning and emergency protocols failing, Jeju Air Flight's 7C-216 spiraled toward its tragic fate. What went wrong in those critical moments? Was it a simple mechanical failure, or was something more sinister at play? How could a routine flight turn into South Korea's deadliest aviation disaster in decades? As the flames engulfed the wreckage, the answers remained elusive, leaving behind only heartbreak and haunting questions. What happened in those final moments, and could this tragedy have been prevented? On a cold December morning, Jeju Air Flight 7C-216 made its final descent toward Muin Airport. Passengers, returning from Bangkok, eagerly anticipated being reunited with their loved ones. But what should have been a routine landing turned into a tragedy. At 8:58 a.m., air traffic control warned of a potential collision, heightening the tension. Moments later, the landing gear failed to deploy, setting off a disastrous chain of events. By 9:07 a.m., the pilots attempted an emergency belly landing. Sparks flew as the undercarriage scraped the tarmac, but the aircraft couldn't slow down. It crashed into barriers, exploded into flames, and left behind a scene of devastation. Out of 181 people on board, only 2 survived, rescued from the wreckage with haunting memories of that fateful morning. The final 6 minutes remained clouded in mystery. Was the landing gear malfunction due to a mechanical failure, or something as unexpected as a bird strike? Why was the ground crew seemingly unprepared? And could their inaction have contributed to the catastrophe? As investigators pored over black box data and interviewed survivors, unsettling truths began to emerge. This tragedy isn't just about a flight gone wrong. It's about systemic failures, ignored warnings, and lives forever changed. Could it have been avoided? December 29, 2024 began like any other morning at Muin International Airport. Situated over 280 kilometers from Seoul, this quiet regional hub became the site of South Korea's deadliest aviation disaster. On board Jeju Air Flight 7C-216 were 181 passengers, including families returning from holidays and 2 Thai nationals, all eager to return home. Jeju Air, known for its reliability, had built a strong reputation in low-cost travel. The aircraft, a Boeing 737-800, was part of a respected global fleet, and the experienced cockpit crew, one with over 6,800 flight hours and the other with over 1,600, gave the flight a sense of confidence. The weather was clear and visibility was perfect, but not everything was as it seemed. Earlier that morning, airport staff spotted an unusually large flock of birds near the runway. This rare occurrence should have raised alarms, yet no significant measures were taken to address the potential threat. Tension mounted as air traffic control issued a collision risk warning at 8:58 a.m. Soon after, the pilot of Flight 7C-216 signaled a distress situation. The landing gear wasn't deploying. The pilots, struggling to solve the issue, made several attempts to correct the mechanical failure, but time was running out. As the situation worsened, the crew braced for an emergency belly landing, an already dangerous maneuver made more complicated by the airport's unpreparedness. Foam, critical for extinguishing fires during emergency landings, hadn't been deployed, and fire trucks, typically stationed on standby, were nowhere to be found. At the end of the runway stood a concrete barrier, which could turn a difficult landing into a catastrophic event. As the plane circled, preparing for a final descent, the stakes couldn't have been higher. What should have been a routine landing was spiraling into chaos. Could a bird strike, the malfunctioning landing gear, or the lack of preparation by ground crews have played a role in the unfolding disaster? These unanswered questions would set the stage for an investigation that captivated the world. At 9:07 a.m., Flight 7C-216 made its final approach to Muin International Airport. Inside the cockpit, the pilots were under immense pressure, facing a critical landing gear failure. Outside, the runway stretched ahead, unprepared for what was coming. The plane made a desperate belly landing, slamming into the tarmac. Sparks flew as the undercarriage scraped against the ground, and smoke poured from the tail. The aircraft skidded uncontrollably, crashing past the runway's buffer zone and into a concrete barrier. An explosion engulfed the aircraft in flames, sending thick black smoke billowing into the sky. Witnesses reported seeing sparks on the right wing before the crash, followed by a series of smaller explosions. The plane, once intact, was now a crumpled, burning wreck. Amid the chaos, two survivors, two crew members sitting in the rear of the plane, managed to escape the devastation. One flight attendant later recalled seeing smoke rise from the engine just before the crash. Disoriented and injured, she and her colleague were rescued from the wreckage. For the other 179 people on board, there was no escape. The youngest victim was a 3-year-old boy, and the oldest was a 78-year-old man. At the airport, families anxiously waiting for their loved ones were met with the grim reality of the disaster. Medical teams worked tirelessly, identifying victims as grief filled the terminal. As the smoke cleared, critical questions arose. Why wasn't the runway equipped with fire suppression foam? Why weren't fire trucks positioned for the emergency? And why was there a concrete barrier at the end of the runway, which turned a difficult landing into a disaster? What began as a routine flight turned into South Korea's deadliest aviation disaster in decades, leaving 179 dead, 2 survivors, and a nation demanding answers. As investigators scoured the wreckage, they turned to the black boxes for insight. These critical devices contained mechanical data and recorded the final moments in the cockpit. One theory emerged early on: a bird strike. Air traffic control had reported an unusually dense flock of birds near the runway just before the crash. Could the birds have damaged the landing gear, causing it to fail? While plausible, experts were skeptical, noting that bird strikes rarely cause such catastrophic mechanical failures. Attention also turned to Moon International Airport's emergency response, or lack thereof. There was no fire suppression foam on the runway, no fire trucks in sight, and a concrete barrier at the end of the runway that worsened the crash's impact. These oversights hinted at systemic flaws in the airport's safety measures. The pilot's actions were also scrutinized. Both seasoned professionals, they worked desperately to troubleshoot the landing gear failure and execute the belly landing. But questions lingered. Was there an alternative course of action that could have saved the flight? Survivor accounts added chilling details. One flight attendant recalled seeing smoke rising from the engine moments before the crash. Another, suffering from memory loss, could only describe the impact in fragments. Their testimonies, combined with technical evidence, painted a picture of chaos and desperation. Ground crew failures also raised alarms. Why weren't emergency measures taken after the landing gear malfunction was identified? Why was the plane directed to a runway that wasn't prepared for such an emergency? As public outrage mounted, the South Korean government pledged transparency, with acting President Choi Sang-mok declaring a national mourning period. The investigation uncovered a tangled web of failures, mechanical malfunctions, inadequate safety measures, and missed opportunities to avert catastrophe. What began as a routine flight exposed systemic weaknesses that had devastating consequences. South Korea's worst aviation disaster became a call for accountability. In the wake of the tragedy, Moon International Airport was declared a special disaster zone. Flags were flown at half-mast, and a national mourning period was declared. Memorial altars were set up, and citizens came together in grief. The loss of 179 lives shook the nation, and questions of accountability continued to simmer. For the 2 survivors, their lives were forever changed. Both struggled with the trauma of surviving the crash, with vivid memories of the explosion and the chaos that followed. One survivor, suffering from memory loss, repeatedly asked, "What happened? Why am I here?" Their ordeal, along with the grief of families, underscored the lasting emotional scars of the tragedy. Public outrage turned to Moon Airport's failures. How could such critical safety measures be overlooked? Why wasn't the runway equipped with fire suppression foam? Why was a concrete barrier placed so close to the runway? These were questions that the families of victims demanded answers to. The crash reignited global debates about aviation safety, with experts questioning the maintenance and emergency procedures of budget airlines like Jeju Air. Meanwhile, the tragedy cast a harsh light on South Korea's broader systemic issues, which were exacerbated by the political turmoil at the time. The Jeju Air Flight 7C-216 disaster was more than just an aviation tragedy. It was a call for reform, accountability, and vigilance in the face of danger. It revealed cracks in safety measures and emergency preparedness, leaving behind a legacy of loss and a nation's commitment to ensuring such a tragedy never happens again. As the wreckage of Flight 7C-216 smoldered, the world was left grappling with the harsh truth. How could so many warning signs go unnoticed? Was the bird strike really to blame? Or was it the combination of overlooked safety measures and a flawed emergency response? Could this tragedy have been avoided if protocols were followed, or if the runway was properly prepared? As the survivors heal and families mourn, these unanswered questions linger. Will this disaster spark real change, or will we forget, only to witness another catastrophe? The tragedy of Flight 7C216 is a painful reminder. Will we ever learn? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth stories.